James Davis is going to ask some questions on
Yes,
this.
thank you. So is this country effectively exploiting opportunities to lead international astronomical programmes? To either or both of you, really?
We're not exploiting as well as we could. We're perhaps doing quite well. The recent invention of this kind of bilateral thing for the UK Space Agency has been very good, because for the first time we can actually have deals with other countries that don't go through ESA. So that's been very good, but that's a fairly small scale thing, and there's a lot more we could do. I think the other thing that worries me a bit, I think everyone has been saying how good the UK is in astronomy, and I think that's right. And historically, I'd say in terms of quantity of research, we were probably number 2. In quality, we were probably number 1. So quantity, the US always won, but in quality, we probably did better. But there are a lot of other countries that are coming up that are now quite competitive with us. So France and Germany put a lot of money into astronomy. Professor Heyman's mentioned India and China. And it's not a bad thing that there's more of a larger pool of competition. But I think we're probably falling behind a bit in terms of not the money we put into kind of assets. So there have been big investments, UK investments, in things like the Square Kilometre Array, the LSST, Euclid, but it's the money going into the people that's the problem, and it has been for quite a while. We can't always exploit these. When we're trying to compete with the French and Germans, we've actually got one hand behind our backs because we do not have enough people, postdocs and students, to work on the actual data.
Yeah.
Could I just add a little bit on that? It's one of the things that I think a lot of projects find. You put a lot of money into capital, obviously, and well-spent capital. But then the problem is that project may be 10 years long. Our grant funding works on a 3-year period, typically, not on a 10-year period. And having stability of funding that allows you to go right through that project and exploit it, those two timescales are not well matched. And we would welcome some scheme which gave more, not necessarily more money, though yes, please, if you can, obviously. But often it's the stability of funding that causes the problem, not the actual funding itself.
Okay. So 2 clear points raised there. Can we quantify the level of investment in people that we'd be looking for?
Well, more, basically. Okay. I don't know how. I mean, to say compare the UK and France or Germany, I'm not quite sure of the actual difference. Okay. But we clearly do invest much less. And the other thing that's perhaps, I think, interesting to note is that the way research funding is done in the UK is very much a case of some person with a faculty position like me apply for a grant, and I then fund a younger person on a 3-year timescale. It's highly competitive. It's quite flexible, so in a way that system is quite good for taking advantage of new opportunities. But there are major disadvantages. So you don't get the long-term funding because it's only a 3-year postdoc for people. You don't put sustained amounts of money into certain research areas. And the other thing, I think, is the actual postdocs themselves, because they don't have an opportunity to actually have their own money. So in the old days, back in PPARC's days, we had these postdoctoral research fellowships. So someone could come out of a PhD and have a bright idea and get their own fellowship. Now they have to rely on some older person having a grant and then employing them on that person's idea rather than their own idea. Yes. So I think the structure of research funding is perhaps not all it might be.
Okay. Moving on to a different topic, dark skies. Have some awareness of this locally. The Clwydian Range, I know, has been applying to the International Dark Sky Association to achieve recognition, and I think there's an all-party group on dark skies here as well. So Professor Edmonds, how much of a problem is light and satellite pollution for UK astronomers, and how can this best be addressed?
Well, it's becoming a worldwide problem, and there are 2 aspects to it. One is just, if you like, it's certainly a local problem, if you like to put it that way, is whether when you walk out of your house, can you see the sky? Can you see the Milky Way? Or have we become a race that no longer lives half our life seeing the universe around us? and all that implies for our philosophy and our interest in the skies. That's one problem. That's something you can do about, and the dark skies are trying to make sure that we do at least have reserves where you can go and see that. A major problem, how for professional astronomy, if you like, is going to be particularly the satellite constellations. And we've made representations. There are international bodies to which we make representation. We make representation to you too now, is that we have to be careful to be able to preserve the opportunity to do research in the skies. And if you have something like 10,000 satellites all running in a constellation together with shiny outsides, you do see those in your telescope when they go past, and they can cause major problems in interpretation. Even worse is if you have that number of telescopes with communications equipment, and the communications equipment is not working absolutely perfectly, but is leaking into side frequencies. That's the end of your radio astronomy. And it's not an insoluble problem, but obviously the problem is the commercial interests behind those satellite constellations and so on is extremely high. It's a lot of money going on that. And it's very important that we get international regulation. We're not saying don't do any of it, just a lot of it can be mitigated if you have, you make sure that satellites aren't reflective, you have very, very strict things about your electronic equipment, and you have a way of turning it off if it doesn't work. So there are things that can be done, but there's got to be goodwill in that, and it's got to be international. But it's in terms of the long-term future of astronomy, is extremely important.
So is the UK government currently engaged in making those representations internationally? Or sufficiently so, or other bodies in the UK?
I was hoping you could tell us that. There are, we do talk. The Space Agency obviously is very involved in it too, in talking about this. But we welcome and will continue to push for good interaction.
James Davis.
Yes, thank you. So we've heard about Jodrell Bank, but in more general terms, what are the UK astronomical telescopes and observatories in terms of development? What level of development are they at? What barriers do they face? Professor Barstow.
Well, I actually think we're in a very good position. We benefit hugely from our membership of the European Southern Observatory and access to major facilities, including the forthcoming extremely large telescope, which will be the largest telescope in the world, and probably will remain so for almost a decade once it comes online in the next 2 to 3 years. Similarly, in the space area, our participation in ESA allows us, as a relatively small country, to play on a huge international field, and it actually enables very strongly the competitive position that we already have in astronomy. The missions that ESA provide, we could not build as a country on our own. So we have a shared approach to this, and it includes things like the James Webb Space Telescope, which is clearly at the forefront of space-based astronomy at the moment, in which the UK had a leading role. So I think we're actually very well placed. The difficult bit is to maintain that going forward. We do have leadership roles in a range of ESA missions and a range of instruments that go on these ground-based telescopes. And there are some gaps. Steve Eales mentioned one around the sort of sub-millimetre wavelength where we've lost a bit of ground. And I think it is important for us to look across astronomy and to make sure that we don't allow any holes to emerge in our capability, because when we're observing objects in space or from the ground, we need to look at all the kind of wavelengths that might be available to us, and so having that complementary coverage from the various facilities is critical.
So the international facilities are critical to UK astronomers.
Absolutely.
Is there anything that you need to say about facilities based within the UK itself before we move on?
It's hard to do, apart from radio, it's hard to do ground-based astronomy from the UK. The weather isn't great, as I think has been alluded to. I think from a UK-only perspective, I think things like the UK Space Agency bilateral programme has been a very important new contribution to what we do, because it allows us to grow capability. If we want to be part of international consortia, we need to have something to bring to the table. So making sure we invest locally in new technologies that we can say, we can do this for you, are really important. So making sure we get technology development right. The bilateral programme is also important for developing our industrial partnerships and helping our space industry to also compete for large contracts within, for example, ESA.
And finally, in terms of the international dimension, I have, you mentioned the extremely large telescope, or at least the wider scheme that falls into, and I've seen mirror segments being polished in St Asaph in my constituency by Wrexham University, so that's a contribution towards it, which is great. But what is the access like for British astronomers to those international facilities? I know that's not yet up and running, that particular telescope.
Do you mean for observers?
Yes, for
as
observers.
Opposed to industry. Well, it's perfectly straightforward. These facilities are available to UK astronomers universally.
Right.
We have a right to apply for time on that. And then how well we do depends on how well we write our applications. We do well because we have a vibrant community that has got a lot of good ideas. So to maintain our levels of access, we need to support that community, and we've discussed in some of the earlier parts of this evidence session some of the issues around that, so I won't repeat that.
Okay, thank you, Chair.
Thank you, James.